Hello guys, close your eyes and imagine the gentle crackle of a small fire under an open sky. The air is cool on your skin and the scent of dried leaves and rich earth surrounds you. In the dim orange glow, a figure crouches, grinding dry leaves and roots with a stone mortar and pestle. The soft crickets and distant night birds accompany this rhythmic crush of herb against stone. A quiet village healer is preparing something ancient, something deeply human. This is the beginning of a long, quiet story. The story of people and the mind-altering plants they discovered. Tonight, we will journey together across thousands of years, tracing the slow, winding path of humans and the substances they have used to heal, to see visions, to find comfort, and sometimes just to feel a little less pain. It is a story whispered in forgotten tombs and written in old scrolls, painted in cave art, and hidden in dusty apothecary jars. It is not a tale of loud battles or famous heroes, but a subtler thread woven through all of human history. It is the long, quiet history of drugs, from sacred roots to silent wars. We begin our journey in a time before writing, before cities, when our ancestors moved carefully through forests and across plains. Imagine a small band of early humans huddled around a fire tens of thousands of years ago. They lived by hunting and gathering, by knowing the land intimately. One day, perhaps, someone in the group finds a strange mushroom or leaf and decides to taste it. At first, nothing happens. Then a gentle shift. Colors seem brighter. The firelight dances in new shapes. The person might laugh, or feel oddly light, or speak of seeing something that isn't there. Around the fire, others listen quietly. They have no words like drug or chemistry, but they understand that this plant has a power. It might be seen as a gift from the spirits of the forest, or simply a curious food that makes the mind wander. These earliest encounters with psychoactive plants are lost to time, but archaeologists have found intriguing hints. In the soil of ancient hearths, they sometimes find charred seeds and residues that tell a story. For instance, in a cold desert in Utah, scientists discovered burnt seeds of wild tobacco in a fire pit used by hunter-gatherers over 12,000 years ago. Imagine that. Long before farming or writing, people gathered around a fire, perhaps chewing or inhaling the smoke of tobacco leaves. We don't know exactly how they used it. They might have chewed the leaves for a subtle buzz or tossed some on the fire to enjoy its fragrant smoke. But the evidence is there showing that even in the Ice Age, human beings sought out the unique properties of certain plants. It's likely that our prehistoric ancestors learned about these plants by trial and observation. They watched animals nibble on fermented fruit and become unsteady. They saw which herbs sick or wounded animals might seek out. They experimented, tasting a leaf here, a root there. Some plants were food, some were poison, and a few had effects that were mysterious and profound. A bitter leaf might calm pain, a cluster of berries might cause strange dreams. Over generations, this knowledge grew quietly. It was passed down, not in books, but in stories and rituals. Perhaps around those same night fires, elders taught the young which plants could heal the body and which could open the door to other realms of perception. Picture a healer in a small Paleolithic camp. By day, she gathers roots and leaves. By night, she tends to the suffering. If a hunter is injured, she might chew up willow bark and make a poultice. The salicylic acid in it dulls pain, though she doesn't know the chemistry, only that it works. For fever, maybe an infusion of a certain bitter plant. And for those troubled in spirit or lost in grief, she might use something special, perhaps a few crushed seeds or a sip of a mildly fermented brew, to soothe their mind or bring comforting visions. This healing knowledge is practical, but it is also spiritual. The line between medicine and magic is very thin here. A plant that eases pain can feel like a gift from benevolent spirits. A mushroom that brings peculiar visions might be seen as a path to communicate with the unseen world. We can imagine those quiet nights and early dawns as the healer hums a soft chant and a patient drifts into a soothed sleep. Perhaps the tribe's lore says these plants were gifts from ancestor spirits or the Earth Mother. The experience of an altered state would have been deeply meaningful in a world without science to explain it. It might have felt like touching the sacred. The actual traces of these practices sometimes survive in astonishing ways. In a cave high in the mountains of present-day Bolivia, archaeologists found a small leather pouch left behind about 1,000 years ago, long after the Stone Age, but still by a people without writing. Inside that pouch were the remnants of a tiny toolkit, wooden snuffing tubes, carved bone spatulas for grinding, and chemical traces of several different psychoactive plants. It seems a shaman or healer carried this bag of wonders. There were traces of coca leaves, which offer a gentle stimulant when chewed and can ward off hunger and fatigue. There are also traces of powerful hallucinogens, chemicals like harmine and DMT, the very ingredients that, when brewed together, become the potent, vision-giving drink known today as ayahuasca. In that dry mountain cave, we glimpse a moment, frozen in time, a traveling healer preparing for rituals, carrying the means to induce visions and transcendence. What's remarkable is that some of these plants were not local to the area where the pouch was found. This suggests that people journeyed far or traded to obtain them. Even in ancient times, there were networks, quiet, informal routes by which knowledge and sacred plants spread from one group to another. A root from the rainforest might find its way into the high Andes, leaves from coastal plains might be carried into deserts. The human fascination with these substances ensured they were shared, bartered, and explored widely. Another discovery, across the world in a desert of Central Asia, paints a similar picture. In the ruins of a remote burial tent nearly 2.5 millennia old, archaeologists found large jars filled with dried cannabis flowers. The people who left them were likely shamans or chiefs of an ancient nomadic tribe. The dry air preserved the plant so well that even after 2,400 years, its chemical potency was evident. These ancient people may have inhaled the smoke during funerary rituals or thrown the herb onto a fire as part of a ceremony to bid farewell to the departed. We know from ancient Greek writings that some nomads, possibly the Scythians, did exactly this, tossing hemp onto hot stones inside tents and bathing in the pungent smoke, wailing and singing in an ecstatic rite. So here, in this silent tomb on the steppe, we find confirmation that cannabis, a plant still used around the world today, was already part of great cities or empires. In caves and rock shelters, hints of prehistoric drug use also appear in art on the walls and in the litter left behind by Longo inhabitants. On a cave ceiling in California, a red pinwheel-like pattern was painted centuries ago by people of the Chumash culture. For a long time, observers wondered what that symbol meant. Then, researchers found, tucked into crevices of the cave ceiling, little wads of fibrous plant matter. They realized these were quids, chewed lumps of plant placed deliberately in the cracks. Chemical tests revealed the plant was datura, a local hallucinogenic flower known for its trumpet-shaped blossoms and dangerous dream-inducing properties. Among the Chumash, datura was sacred, used carefully in rites of passage and spiritual quests. It turns out that the pinwheel painting likely represents the datura flower itself, which opens at dusk in a spiral, and during communal gatherings, people in that cave chewed the plant to enter trance-like states. The everyday debris of their chewing and the sacred art above interweave, showing that experiencing an altered mind state was not just for lone shamans, it was a shared part of community life, integrated with art and story, and perhaps timed with the rhythms of the seasons. From the frozen steppes to desert caves, from jungle shelters to lakeside villages, the archaeological record softly echoes with such findings. A prehistoric burial site in what is now Spain, for example, yielded strands of human hair carefully placed in tubes. When scientists analyzed those hairs, they found traces of alkaloids from plants like ephedra, a stimulant, and nightshade, a hallucinogen. Think of that, 3,000 years ago on a Mediterranean island, someone's hair still holds the chemical ghosts of a ceremonial potion. Perhaps before this person was laid to rest, they participated in a ritual of transformation, ingesting a mixture that quickened the pulse and painted visions behind closed eyes. To find these molecules still clinging to hair after millennia is like hearing a faint song across a vast gulf of time, telling us that yes, those ancient people also explored the mind's depths. In another corner of the world, deep in present-day Texas, archaeologists found little buttons of peyote cactus in a dry cave, left in what seemed to be a ritual context. These buttons were dated to over 5,000 years old. Peyote, a small cactus native to the North American desert, causes powerful hallucinations and has been used by indigenous peoples for spiritual insight and healing for countless generations. To hold a wizened peyote button from millennia past is to know that a person in those distant days also sat somewhere under the night sky, consuming this cactus, perhaps drumming or singing softly, eyes gazing at the stars, but seeing something more in their mind's eye. All these finds, seeds and residues, hair and bones, art and tools, are puzzle pieces. Individually, each is a quiet clue. Together, they form a picture of deep antiquity. Humans, long before writing or formal science, had discovered a host of natural substances that affect the mind and body. They integrated them into their lives in various ways, as medicines, as sacred sacraments, as daily tonics, or as occasional curiosities. We often think of history in terms of kings and battles, but here we are, looking at a different thread. A grandmother somewhere in the Neolithic quietly brewing a calming tea from poppy seeds to help her grandchild sleep through pain. A young hunter learning from his father how chewing certain leaves can stave off hunger during long treks. A painted group in a cave taking a collective visionary journey through shared plant potions. None of these events would have made a loud noise in the historical record. They leave no monuments, no famous chronicles, and yet they are profoundly human moments, repeated countless times across continents and centuries. As time passed and societies grew more complex, this ancient knowledge did not disappear. It evolved, branched, and sometimes was lost and rediscovered. And we move from prehistory into the time of the first civilizations, the early cities and kingdoms. We find that many of these psychoactive plants took on new roles and meanings, woven into the fabric of emerging cultures. Let us gently step forward into the age of temples and scribes, of pharaohs and ziggurats, where the seeds planted in prehistory grew into traditions recorded on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls. In this next stage of our journey, we'll see how the quiet partnership between humans and mind-altering substances continued to flourish in the ancient world, always adapting to the beliefs and needs of each new age. By the time the first cities rose and human societies began recording their knowledge in writing, the use of mind-altering substances had already become woven into daily life and spiritual practice. The quiet thread of drug history now began to leave visible marks in written records and artifacts, allowing us to follow it more closely. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land of the Sumerians and later Babylonians, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform mention plants and potions used for healing. Among these, the opium poppy stands out. Sumerians cultivated poppies as early as the 3rd millennium BC. They called the poppy hulgil, meaning the joy plant. One can imagine a Sumerian healer in a mud brick city like Ur, preparing a thick concoction from poppy resin to ease a patient's pain or to help someone sleep through a feverish night. The knowledge of opium's effects spread along the Fertile Crescent. From Mesopotamia, it passed to the Assyrians and then to the Egyptians. In Egypt, the poppy's sedative and euphoric qualities were embraced in medicine and possibly in ritual. The Egyptians were master herbalists of the ancient world, and their papyrus scrolls record remedies for all manner of ailments. The Abers papyrus, a medical text from around 1500 BC, includes a recipe that likely uses opium to calm a crying infant. A few drops to prevent excessive crying. Imagine an Egyptian mother in Thebes, anxious as her sick child fusses through the night, giving a tiny dose of a bitter herbal mixture as prescribed by the healer. Soon, the child's eyelids grow heavy, and at last there is quiet and rest. Such gentle, everyday mercies were an important part of life. Egyptian culture also mixed spirituality with these practices. They venerated a lion-headed goddess of healing, Sekhmet, and had temple sanctuaries where priest-physicians conducted rituals. It's possible that some ceremonies involved psychoactive substances. There is evidence that Egyptians used blue lotus flowers, which have mild relaxing properties, steeped in wine. Scenes in tomb art often show partygoers holding blue lotus blossoms to their noses, perhaps inhaling its delicate scent as they drink. Whether for spiritual ceremony or leisurely banquet, such combinations likely produced a pleasant, calming intoxication. The boundary between a religious offering and a recreational drink was not always firm. Wine itself was seen as a gift of the gods, and enhancing it with special herbs or flowers could be both sacred and enjoyable. Far to the east, in the Indian subcontinent, another ancient people were finding divine significance in a mysterious plant or potion called soma. The Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts of India, composed around 1500 BC, sing hymns of praise to Soma, described as both a god and a drink that priests prepared. Drinking Soma was said to confer enlightenment, vigor, and communion with the divine. The exact identity of Soma has been lost to time. Some scholars speculate it might have been made from a wild mountain plant or mushroom that produced hallucinogenic effects. Picture a Vedic ritual, fire crackling on an altar under the stars, priests chanting in an ancient tongue as they press and filter a juice that glows golden in the firelight. They drink and feel a rush of exaltation and clarity, believing it to be a gift that opens a channel to the heavens. While we may never know exactly what Soma was, its exalted place in early Indian religion tells us that psychoactive ritual potions were at the heart of spiritual life. India's ancient medical tradition Ayurveda also recognized the use of psychoactive plants. Cannabis, known in Sanskrit as banga or vijaya, was used both recreationally and medicinally in India for millennia. An old text lists cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants which release us from anxiety. By around 1000 BC, cannabis leaves were being ground into drinks, bang or smoked, often in a spiritual context, to honor Shiva, a deity with whom the plant is associated. In everyday life, a villager in ancient India might mix bang paste into a cup of milk with spices, a practice that survives in parts of India today during festivals. The effect is a gentle, dreamy intoxication, considered by many a way to relax and also momentarily step into a more spiritual frame of mind. In ancient China, the tradition of documenting herbal remedies was just as rich. The early Chinese were cultivating hemp, cannabis, for its strong fibers by at least 4000 BC, using it to make rope and cloth. Along with its practical uses, they slowly learned of its other properties. A famous legend speaks of the ancient culture hero, Shen Nong, the divine farmer, around 2700 BC, who taught the people agriculture and medicine. Though part myth, he is credited with tasting hundreds of herbs to test their effects. In the classical Chinese herbal compendium attributed to Shen Nong, though compiled many centuries later, cannabis is mentioned as a plant useful for certain ailments, noting that in large doses it could make one see devils, meaning experience hallucinations. By the first millennium BC, Chinese healers were aware that the cannabis plant's flowers contained the most potent properties. By around 200 AD, Chinese physicians like Hua Tuo were reportedly using a form of cannabis mixed with wine as an anesthetic to perform surgeries, a remarkable early application of a drug to block pain in a controlled way. Imagine a Chinese surgeon in the Han Dynasty preparing to set a badly broken bone. He offers the patient a strong cup of medicated wine. The warmth of the drink spreads. Soon the patient's grimaces soften, awareness dimming as the potion takes hold. In that twilight state, the surgeon can do what is necessary with less agony. Such practices are described in later texts of the era, indicating that by then the Chinese had a sophisticated grasp of some drug effects. Chinese alchemists and physicians also experimented with many other substances, from ephedra, amahuang, a stimulant and decongestant, to opium. Opium likely arrived in China through trade with the West, possibly as early as the later first millennium BC, but it remained a relatively minor medicinal ingredient there for many centuries. More commonly, the Chinese used opium poppies as one ingredient in herbal mixtures for pain relief or to calm coughs. It wouldn't become a widespread recreational drug in China until much later. We will see that story unfold in the 18th and 19th centuries, but the seeds of that future were quietly present in the herb shops of ancient cities. Across the high mountains and deep valleys of Central Asia, nomadic peoples had their own traditions. The shamans of the Siberian Arctic, for example, were known to use Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the classic red-capped, white-spotted toadstools, to induce trance states. Though direct records are scant, these cultures passed knowledge orally. Later observations suggest that Siberian spiritual guides would consume these potent mushrooms to journey in their vision world, communicating with spirits. It's another echo of the same pattern. Throughout the world, many early societies found that certain plants and fungi could open the doors of perception, and they often ritualized these experiences in the figure of the shaman or wise healer. Meanwhile, the ancient Persians and their neighbors also had sacred inebriating beverages. The Zoroastrian text from ancient Persia praise a drink called halma, which seems analogous to the Vedic soma. Under starlit skies in the deserts and oases of what is now Iran, priests would pound and mix herbs to create a visionary brew as part of their worship of Ahura Mazda. Once again, the details are hazy to us now. Halma's identity is debated, with candidates like ephedra often suggested, but the consistent theme is clear. These early civilizations, whether in fertile river valleys or arid plateaus, independently discovered plants or potions that played central roles in their spirituality and medicine. In the Mediterranean world, the Greeks and later the Romans carried forward this legacy of drug use interwoven with culture. The Greeks learned much from the Egyptians and others. By the time of Hippocrates, around 400 BC, opium was a known remedy in the Greek physician's toolkit for severe pains and sleeplessness. They called the poppy's extract opion, which gives us the word opium. Greek physicians and pharmacologists like Dioscorides in the 1st century AD wrote of many medicinal plants including opium, mandrake and henbane, all potent drugs. Mandrake and henbane are plants with hallucinogenic and anesthetic properties, and in moderate doses they were used to induce sleep or relieve pain. A Greek or Roman healer might soak mandrake root in wine to make a sleeping potion for surgery. Indeed, one old Roman recipe for anesthesia involved a mixture of wine with opium and henbane, a strong draught to send a patient into deep sleep, hopefully long enough for a skilled surgeon to complete his work. Beyond medicine, the Greeks also incorporated psychoactive substances into religious rituals. The best known example is the Eleusinian Mysteries, secret rites practiced for nearly 2,000 years near Athens, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. Initiates in these mysteries would drink a special brew called kykeon as part of their ceremony. While the exact recipe is lost, initiates swore never to reveal it, some historians suspect the kykeon may have been enhanced with something mind-altering, possibly ergot, a fungus on grain that contains LSD-like compounds or other psychedelic herbs. Imagine a crowd of initiates, after days of preparation and fasting, drinking the sacred kykeon in the dark of night, and then experiencing a profound collective vision or sense of unity. Many later said that the experience transformed them, removing the fear of death. We cannot be certain what was in the cup, but the notion that a drug could facilitate a spiritual revelation was certainly alive in the ancient world. The everyday use of substances in the classical world was also significant. Wine was consumed by Greeks and Romans as part of daily meals and social life, but it was often more than just fermented grape juice. Recipes survived for spiced and fortified wines. Some had pine resin, like Greek retsina. Others had medicinal herbs dissolved in them. At times, opium was added to wine to create a powerful nightcap. One Greek term, nepenthe, used in Homer's tales, describes a potion given to banish sorrow, likely a wine infused with opium. One can imagine a Greek symposium in a villa courtyard Oil lamps flicker on mosaic floors as friends recline on couches. They pass around a mixing bowl of wine, perhaps spiced or gently laced with a bit of opium or fragrant herbs. Their conversation flows as freely as the drink. Philosophical musings and witty poetry recitations until late into the warm night. The wine relaxes them, dissolving cares, exactly as the mythic Nepenthe was said to do. Commerce was a major vector for these substances to spread in antiquity. By about 1500 BC, the trade routes of the Near East carried small, distinctive containers that modern archaeologists recognize, little clay juglets shaped like the seed pod of a poppy. These have been found in Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. When tested, some juglets show traces of opium. This suggests that merchants shipped opium as a valuable commodity, perhaps exchanging it for gold or fine textiles. It was likely used both as medicine and, for a small elite, as an indulgence at banquets or as a nighttime sedative. Similarly, frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins burned in ritual, were traded from Arabia and the Horn of Africa into the Mediterranean. While not exactly drugs in the modern sense, the fragrant smoke of these resins had mood-altering effects, creating a calming, solemn atmosphere in temples. The ancient world was a trading ground not just of spices and silks, but of substances to soothe the body and alter the mind. By the dawn of the Common Era, around year 1 AD, many drugs we consider modern were already long known. The difference was largely in how they were perceived and used. There was little notion of strict prohibition. Instead, these substances were tools of healing, objects of worship, or pleasurable indulgences, each in its context. A Roman apothecary shop, for instance, might sell poppy syrup for pain alongside dried mandrake, apples, the fruit of the mandrake, sometimes used as a mild sedative, and perhaps imported Indian spices or Arabian aromatics. Knowledge of each plant came with caveats passed down from teacher to student. Use too much and a medicine could become a poison. Use it correctly and it might be a blessing. While we have focused on the old world civilizations, far across the oceans in the Americas, many parallel threads were evolving too. The peoples of Mesoamerica and South America had no contact with Eurasia in antiquity, yet their cultures also developed rich traditions of psychoactive use. The Maya, for example, consumed balche, a fermented honey drink mixed with the bark of a tree, producing a mildly intoxicating, possibly hallucinogenic potion in their rituals. The Aztecs worshipped gods of fertility and rain, with ceremonies that included eating sacred mushrooms they called Teonanacatl, meaning flesh of the gods, which caused vivid visions. One can envision a midnight ritual on a high plateau. An Aztec priest, adorned with jade and feathers, consuming these mushrooms by the light of a pine torch, while around him devotees sway to the steady beat of drums. In the flickering glow, they believe they see the gods dancing, the boundary between the earthly and the divine dissolved by the sacred fungi. In the Andean highlands, the Incas and their predecessors chewed coca leaves routinely, a practice that gave them energy in thin mountain air and held religious significance. Coca was seen as a gift from the earth goddess Pachamama. Shamans in the Amazon brewed ayahuasca, and healers in the North American plains smoked mixtures of tobacco and other plants in pipes to seal treaties or seek spiritual visions. These American traditions developed in isolation from those of Europe, Africa, and Asia, yet they reflect the same human inclinations. By the time European explorers would arrive across the sea, they would find a world where the use of psychoactive plants was as ingrained and nuanced as anywhere else, albeit with different plants. Tobacco, cocoa, peyote, psychedelic mushrooms, and others that the old world had never encountered. For now, in our timeline, we are still in antiquity, before those two worlds collided. In this area, whether in a Greek temple or an Indian village, Chinese clinic or an Egyptian home, the use of natural drugs was normal and accepted. Of course, like anything powerful, these plants and potions were treated with respect and sometimes caution. People knew that certain things were to be used in moderation or only by the experienced. There were likely ancient warnings passed down. Do not eat too much of that plant, or you will wander out of your mind, or only touch those leaves in ceremony under guidance. Societies developed their own forms of regulation through tradition and ritual. The ancient world offers a tableau of drug use that was mostly out in the open, without the concept of criminality attached to it. If you walk through a bustling market in Alexandria in 100 BC, you might smell spices and herbs from all corners of the known world. Among them would be opium at the physician's stall, hemp fibers at the rope makers, frankincense burning at a shrine, and wine jugs being carted to a tavern. Each substance had its place. As religions changed and empires rose and fell, attitudes towards these substances also evolved. For instance, when Christianity began spreading through the Roman world, some early Christian writers frowned on the excesses of pagan feasts and mystery rites, including their drugged indulgences, preaching sobriety and spiritual clarity. In one sense, this was an early moral judgment on certain kinds of intoxication, a sign of shifts to come. Meanwhile, in the East, philosophies like Buddhism emphasized moderation. Some monks abstained from alcohol and mind-altering substances entirely to maintain mindfulness. Still, through antiquity and into the early medieval period, there was no broad concept of a drug crime. People knew these plants could be misused. The ancients lamented drunkards or cautioned against overindulgence. And there were certainly accidental poisonings or addictions noted in texts. Roman writers like Pliny mention individuals becoming too fond of opium, for example, but generally control was a matter of social custom, religion, and personal responsibility rather than law. As we move forward now, we'll see that this permissive, integrated approach would not remain constant. New religions, globalization, and the birth of the modern state would gradually transform how societies viewed drugs. What was once sacred or medicinal might come to be seen as sinful or dangerous under new paradigms. Leaving the classical age behind, we drift into the middle period of history, the medieval era and the age of Islamic and East Asian empires, where the story takes some new turns. Different powers, different faiths, and expanding trade routes all influenced which substances were embraced and which were frowned upon. The thread continues quietly yet unbroken, adapting to each new time and place. As the classical empires faded and the medieval world emerged, new religions and cultures shaped the story of human drug use. In the Middle East and Europe, the rise of Christianity and Islam brought different attitudes. Yet even with new moral frameworks, the age-old relationship with mind-altering substances persisted, adapting quietly under new norms. In the Islamic world, which from the 7th century onward stretched from Spain across North Africa and the Middle East to Central Asia, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad explicitly forbade wine and other intoxicating liquors as affronts to clarity of mind. This religious ban meant that alcohol, so central to Greco-Roman convivial life, was no longer publicly consumed in Muslim communities. However, human desire for some form of release sought other outlets. One such outlet was cannabis, particularly in the form of hashish, the concentrated resin of the plant. By around the 12th century, hashish use had become relatively common in parts of the Islamic world. Sufi mystics, seeking a direct experience of the divine, sometimes used hashish to facilitate states of spiritual ecstasy. In a candlelit courtyard or a quiet garden in Persia, one might find a circle of dervishes, eyes half closed, passing a pipe of smoldering hashish from hand to as they chant the names of God under their breath. The night air heavy with jasmine and smoke, their voices grow slow and dreamy in those moments. They believe the herb opens their hearts, bringing them a step closer to the divine presence. It was thought to relax the strictures of ordinary senses and perhaps feel closer to God, a substitute for the forbidden wine of earlier revelers. Not everyone approved. Islamic scholars were divided on the issue of hashish. Some condemned it as simply another intoxicant to be avoided, while others noted it was not explicitly banned by scripture, since the Quran did not address cannabis. Periodically, rulers in places like Cairo or Baghdad would crack down on hashish dens, seeing them as dens of laziness or moral laxity. There are reports from medieval Cairo of authorities uprooting hemp plants and even punishing habitual users, in one account by pulling out their teeth to deter the habit of chewing the resin. But these measures were usually temporary. Hashish persisted among the populace, quietly filling the role of a social and recreational drug where alcohol could not. Opium, too, found a comfortable place in the medicine cabinets of the Islamic Golden Age. Great physicians like Avicenna in the 10th, 11th century wrote extensively on opium's effectiveness for pain and inducing sleep. Avicenna warned of its powerful nature and the need for caution, but he also called it the most potent of remedies. In the bustling hospitals of Baghdad or Cordoba, a physician might have administered opium syrup to soothe the agony of a patient with dysentery, or to bring relief to someone undergoing a painful procedure in an era before true surgical anesthesia. Such uses were seen as compassionate and wise. The knowledge of opium's uses traveled with Islamic science into medieval Europe as well. Latin translations of Arabic medical texts in places like Salerno and Toledo reintroduced Europeans to opium's medicinal virtues around the 12th century, after some of that knowledge had faded during the earlier Dark Ages. Medieval Europe itself had a complex relationship with mind-altering substances. Alcohol, mostly ales, beers, and wines, was deeply ingrained in daily life, often safer to drink than contaminated water. Monks brewed beer in monasteries, and wine was a standard part of the diet from peasant to prince. The church frowned on excessive drunkenness, viewing it as a sin of gluttony and a lapse of spiritual vigilance. But moderate drinking was accepted even in monastic orders, with some abbeys allotting a certain amount of beer or wine per person per day. In fact, many monastic orders became famous for their herbal liqueurs and ales, using their knowledge of local plants to flavor and fortify brews. These drinks, though intoxicating, were framed as nourishing tonics and aids to conviviality. Beyond alcohol, European folk medicine still remembered various soporific and hallucinogenic herbs. Wise women and village healers passed down knowledge of plants like henbane, belladonna, deadly nightshade, and mandrake. These could ease pain and induce sleep when applied properly, or, in higher doses, cause profound delirium and visions. Such herbs became entwined with folklore and superstition. Tales of witches brewing potions that let them fly or transform likely originated from the use of nightshade plants in ointments. Some historical accounts suggest that certain individuals, later accused as witches, concocted salves with belladonna or henbane and applied them to their skin or inhaled their fumes, inducing floating sensations or wild hallucinations of night rides, giving birth to legends of broomstick flights. We can imagine an isolated cottage at a forest's edge, a healer stirring a simmering cauldron of herbs over the fire. She might be making a balm for aches, a perfectly ordinary task. Or perhaps she knows that a pinch of this flower, a scrap of that root, rendered into an oil, can bring about strange dreams or trances. Such secret knowledge was the kind that inquisitors later eyed with great suspicion. As the medieval period progressed, more formal experimentation with drugs emerged as well. By the 13th century, the art of distillation, refining a fermented brew into concentrated alcohol, was perfected by Arab alchemists and then adopted in Europe. This led to the creation of aqua vitae, the water of life, early brandy and similar spirits. Initially, these potent spirits were treated as medicinal elixirs. Physicians believed aqua vitae could preserve health and prolong life, and it was sold by apothecaries. Of course, people also discovered its more straightforward use, a quick and powerful route to inebriation. The production of hard liquor like brandy and later whiskey began in the late medieval period, quietly setting the stage for new social habits and problems around alcohol in coming centuries. During these same centuries, trade and travel were expanding between cultures. The Silk Road caravans still wound from Asia to the Middle East. Alongside silk and spices, they carried medicinal herbs and resins. A merchant in the 14th century might load dried opium from Indian poppy fields onto a camel in Isfahan to be traded in a Syrian port, or carry sacks of coffee beans from Yemeni markets northward. Knowledge of Eastern remedies like banga, cannabis, and reports of stranger substances percolated into Europe through travelers' tales. Marco Polo, in the late 13th century, wrote of hashish in the east and of a sect of assassins, likely the Nizaris Miles of Persia, whose old man leader purportedly gave followers drugged potions to inspire visions of paradise. This tale, though likely exaggerated by imagination, fascinated Europeans. It was one of the first times they heard of a drug being used in a quasi-military or political context. The very word assassin in European languages is thought to derive from hashashin, indicating hashish eater, a label for that sect. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, other psychoactive traditions thrived. In parts of Africa, the kola nut, high in caffeine, was chewed as a stimulant. In what is now Ethiopia and Yemen, people were brewing coffee by the 15th century, and others were chewing the fresh shoots of cat for a mild euphoria. In South Asia and the Pacific, people chewed the betel nut, a raka nut wrapped in a betel leaf with a bit of lime, a practice that gave a warm burst of energy and reddened their mouths, an everyday social ritual still common in those regions. By the late Middle Ages, new, globally important drugs were on the horizon. Coffee, native to Ethiopia, had made its way to the Arabian Peninsula. By the 15th and 16th centuries, coffee was being cultivated and traded in the Islamic world, especially from the Yemeni port of Mocha. Sufi monks in Yemen drank coffee to stay awake during night devotions, finding that it helped maintain alertness and spiritual focus. Coffee houses flourished in cities like Constantinople and Cairo, becoming centers of conversation, chess games, and poetry, much as they are today. One can envision an evening at a grand coffee house in Istanbul, around 1700. Oil lamps casting golden light on carved wooden panels, the air rich with the aroma of freshly roasted beans. Men in turbans and robes sit on low cushions, cradling tiny porcelain cups of strong coffee. They discuss news of far-off lands and recite verses by Rumi or Hafiz. The coffee's gentle stimulation keeps their wits sharp and sleep at bay, fueling debates that last deep into the night. Another beloved stimulant, tea, had been the preferred brew in East Asia for centuries. By medieval times, tea drinking in China and Japan was raised to an art form, with elaborate ceremonies emphasizing grace and presence. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European traders like the Portuguese and Dutch would encounter tea in Asia and bring it west, where it eventually became a staple, and there were other traditional stimulants in different corners of the world. Throughout South Asia and the Pacific, people chewed the areca nut, betel, wrapped in betel leaf with lime, a practice that gave a mild lift, reddening the lips and symbolizing hospitality. In East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, communities for generations had picked fresh hut leaves each day to chew in the afternoon sun, absorbing a gentle amphetamine-like boost that quickened the pulse and brightened conversation. These customs were part of the social fabric, as ordinary as drinking tea, showing again that wherever one looks, humans found something in nature to pep themselves up or bring them together in ritual. The biggest turning point in the global drug story came with the age of exploration and the Columbian Exchange, beginning in the late 15th century. When Europeans set sail across the oceans, they didn't just exchange gold and silver for spices and porcelain. They exchanged entire pharmacopoeias of plants and substances between the old world and the new. Two worlds of drug traditions that had evolved separately for millennia were suddenly thrust into contact. One of the most significant introductions from the Americas to Europe and beyond was tobacco. Native to the New World, tobacco had been cultivated and smoked, and sometimes chewed or taken as snuff, by indigenous peoples for countless generations, often in sacred contexts. American shamans and chiefs used tobacco smoke in ceremonies to carry prayers or seal agreements, Everyday folks enjoyed it for simple pleasure or relief. In 1492, Columbus and his crew observed Caribbean islanders inhaling smoke from dried leaves, an unfamiliar practice to the Europeans. Soon, sailors and settlers adopted the habit. By the mid-1000s, 500 years, tobacco was being written about in Spain and Portugal as a marvel. Some saw it as having medicinal virtues, others purely as recreation. Tobacco's spread was rapid. Sailors took it to Africa, Ottoman traders introduced it to the Middle East. By the early 17th century, it had reached India, Japan, and China. Reactions varied. Some rulers were alarmed and tried to ban this strange new smoke. The Ottoman Sultan Murad IV in the 1630s and the Ming Emperor in China both issued prohibitions, seeing it as a potentially subversive pastime. In Russia, Tsar Michael in 1649 forbade tobacco under pain of severe punishment, but these bans were short-lived or widely ignored. Tobacco's appeal was too strong. It gave a mild stimulation, a ritual of pause and contemplation, and yes, a swift addiction for many. Over time, most societies relented and integrated tobacco into daily life. By the 1370s, elegant gentlemen in Paris snuffed powdered tobacco from jewel boxes. Ladies in Tokyo smoked slender pipes, and even where bans remained on the books, tobacco was quietly tolerated. A new global vice had been born, one that would become enormously profitable for empires and devastating to public health in the long run, though those consequences lay far in the future. Along with tobacco, the Americas offered other novel substances that traveled east. Cacao, from which chocolate is made, was introduced to Spain by returning conquistadors in the 1500s after they encountered it in the Aztec court. The Aztecs drank chocolate as a bitter, spiced beverage, often with chili pepper, called xocoatl, reserved for nobility and warriors. The Spanish added sugar and vanilla to suit their tastes, and by the 17th century, sipping hot chocolate had become a fashionable delight in European capitals. While chocolate's active chemicals, like theobromine and a bit of caffeine, are mild, the psychological effect, a gentle uplifting of mood, made it a cherished comfort. From the old world to the new, meanwhile, came alcohol, in stronger forms than many indigenous Americans had ever encountered. While native peoples of the Americas did have traditional alcoholic beverages, like chicha, a corn beer, or pulque, a fermented agave drink, they generally did not have distilled spirits. European colonizers introduced brandy and rum, which native populations often had little cultural experience in handling. Tragically, liquor was sometimes used by Europeans as a tool of exploitation in trade, and indigenous communities suffered greatly from new patterns of alcohol abuse, having had no gradual, centuries-long adaptation to its presence. Scenes of previously alcoholized peoples becoming inebriated on imported spirits played out from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, often with grievous social consequences. Some native leaders recognized the danger and pleaded for restrictions on alcohol, but colonial powers seldom heeded such requests when profit or strategic advantage was to be had. Conversely, the Europeans who went to colonize the Americas encountered indigenous drug practices and often reacted by suppressing them. Spanish missionaries and authorities in Mesoamerica, for instance, were shocked by rituals involving peyote, mushrooms, or other entheogens, and quickly condemned them as devil worship. The use of peyote cactus by the Chichimeca and other northern Mexican tribes was banned under pain of severe punishment, driving the practice underground. Though it never died out, it would re-emerge centuries later in the context of the Native American church. The Aztecs' sacred mushrooms similarly had to go into hiding, surviving in remote villages away from prying colonial eyes. An immense amount of indigenous knowledge about medicinal and sacred plants was lost or kept secret during this period of forced conversions and cultural upheaval. While the New World's botanical treasures were being parceled out to Old World markets, tobacco, chocolate, various exotic spices, and medicinal barks like cinchona for malaria, the Old World's drugs also traveled west. European colonists took with them opium, for example, introducing it into North America and elsewhere. They brought cannabis as hemp for fiber, which sometimes segued into cannabis for smoking among settler populations or slaves, and coffee and tea, those old world stimulants, eventually reached the Americas through colonial trade, becoming part of life there too. By the 18th century, one could truly speak of a global network of psychoactive substances. A gentleman in London might start his day with a chocolate or coffee, smoke Virginia tobacco from a pipe made in Turkey, take a dose of laudanum, opium tincture made from Indian poppies for his aches, and perhaps drink wine at night fortified with spices from Ceylon, all in one day without leaving home. This interconnection was new in scale, and with it came new challenges. One such challenge was the beginning of formal addiction problems on a mass scale in certain areas. In China, the introduction of smoking tobacco around the early 1600s eventually led to people mixing tobacco with opium, and by the 1700s, a practice of pure opium smoking had taken hold. First among the elite, then more widely. The British, through the East India Company, capitalized on this in the late 18th and early 19th centuries by growing opium in India and smuggling it into China in huge quantities despite Chinese laws against it. The social harm in China became alarming. By some estimates, millions were forming habits of daily opium use, from wealthy officials to poor laborers, when the Chinese government under the Qing dynasty tried to stamp out the trade, notably in 1839 when Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed opium chests in Canton. The British responded with force, leading to the First Opium War. China's defeat in that conflict and a second opium war 2 decades later forced it to tolerate the opium trade and ceded ports like Hong Kong to the British. These events entrenched opium's availability and worsened mass addiction in China, creating a legacy of pain that the Chinese people still remember as a national humiliation. All the while, back in Europe and North America, new scientific and industrial developments were quietly transforming the drug landscape once again, ushering us into the modern era. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the age of enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were in full swing. Science brought advances in chemistry that allowed us to peer deeper into nature's pharmacy, and industry allowed mass production and distribution of drugs as never before. The 19th century arrived with both great optimism and great indulgence in the realm of drugs. It was an era of scientific advance, industrial progress, and at the same time, widespread casual use of substances that we would later come to regard as dangerous or addictive. In many ways, the 19th century set the stage for the modern drug dilemmas. Miraculous new medicines were discovered and embraced, followed by new waves of dependence and abuse, and eventually the first attempts at legal control. One of the earliest breakthroughs of the 1800s was born in a quiet laboratory in Germany. In 1804, a young apothecary's assistant named Friedrich Sertiner isolated a crystalline substance from opium. He named it morphine after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was the first alkaloid ever isolated from a plant, the dawn of extracting pure compounds from herbal sources. At first, this discovery was celebrated as a triumph of medicine. Here was the potent essence of opium, which could be given in precise, tiny doses. Doctors hoped morphine would be a wonder drug, providing powerful pain relief without the messiness of crude opium. And indeed, morphine revolutionized pain management. During the brutal conflicts of the mid-19th century, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, morphine was used liberally to treat soldiers' injuries. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s amplified its impact by allowing morphine to be injected directly into the bloodstream for nearly instantaneous effect. Yet with this blessing came a hidden curse: addiction on a scale not seen before. Many soldiers survived battle thanks to morphine, only to find themselves shackled to a dependence on the drug that had soothed their pain. In the United States after the Civil War, opiate addiction became so common among veterans that it earned a nickname: the soldier's disease. Though not fully understood at the time, thousands of former soldiers and many other civilians discovered that if they tried to stop taking the drug, they felt terribly ill and agitated. Classic withdrawal symptoms. Still, morphine's benefits were so undeniable that society largely viewed this dependency with sympathy rather than scorn. These were patients in need of continued dosing, not criminals. The idea of punishing someone for using a drug was largely absent. Addiction was seen either as an unfortunate side effect of necessary medical care or, at worst, a personal weakness. Around the same time, another drug from a far-off plant began to captivate Western medicine and culture: coca, the leaf treasured by Andean peoples. For centuries, indigenous communities in the Andes chewed coca leaves to stave off hunger and fatigue and to feel energized in thin mountain air. To them, coca was sacred, but it wasn't until the mid-19th century that European chemists managed to extract its active ingredient. In 1859, Albert Niemann isolated cocaine from coca leaves. By the 1880s, cocaine was being hailed as a stimulant and tonic in Europe and America. Perhaps its most famous proponent was a young Viennese neurologist, Sigmund Freud, who in 1884 wrote an enthusiastic paper on coca, praising the drug's ability to induce cheerfulness, energy, and stamina, and even suggesting it could help wean morphine addicts off their drug, an error in judgment that led some patients from one addiction to another. Cocaine found a practical medical use as well. It was the first effective local anesthetic. Doctors discovered that when applied to the eye or gums, or injected near nerves, it could numb sensation, which was revolutionary for surgeries, especially in ophthalmology and dentistry. A Viennese surgeon, Karl Koller, famously demonstrated cocaine's anesthetic property for eye surgery in 1884, ushering in a new era of operative medicine. But cocaine's non-medical allure spread even faster. It was added to patent medicines and elixirs, touted to boost vigor. A French entrepreneur, Angelo Mariani, created Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine infused with coca extract, which became wildly popular, even enjoyed by Pope Leo III, who supposedly carried a flask. In the United States, a pharmacist named John Pemberton formulated in 1886 a new coca leaf and cola nut flavored syrup, which, when mixed with carbonated water, he marketed as a temperance-friendly brain tonic and cure for ailments. This drink, named Coca-Cola, originally did contain a modest amount of cocaine, alongside caffeine from cola nuts. A glass of early Coca-Cola likely gave a gentle cocaine lift, enough to brighten one's mood on a hot afternoon. Only in the early 1900s did the company quietly remove the cocaine, bowing to shifting public attitudes, though they retained non-narcotic coca leaf flavoring for tradition's sake. Opium itself remained ubiquitous throughout the 19th century in much of the world. Laudanum, a solution of opium in alcohol, was a staple remedy in Europe and America, used by all classes of society. If a baby was teething and inconsolable, a few drops of laudanum cordial would ensure a calm night. If a gentleman had a relentless cough, an opium-laced lozenge might soothe it. Women suffering from menstrual cramps or hysteria, catch-all term of the era, often found relief in a spoonful of laudanum. Innumerable Victorian women were prescribed the drug for female troubles or general malaise. Nurses also spoon-fed laudanum to infants to quiet colic. The Romantic and Victorian literary circles have many references to opium. Writers like Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey wrote openly of their experiences with it. De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, describes the dreamy euphoria and nightmarish depths of his laudanum habit. Yet despite the known dependence it could foster, laudanum use carried little stigma. It was sold freely in pharmacies and even general stores. Housewives and writers, poets and labourers alike nursed quiet laudanum habits. Picture a quiet London parlour around the year 1870. A middle-aged woman in a high-collared dress carefully measures a spoon of laudanum tincture into her evening tea. Outside her window, gas lights flicker in the fog. Inside, as she sips the bitter, herbal brew, a gentle wave of calm softens the edges of her exhaustion. Such a scene would have been unremarkable in Victorian times, just a normal part of life's routine, comfort. Indeed, the second half of the 19th century in America and Britain is often called the golden age of papered medicines. These were proprietary concoctions, sold with bold promises and colorful labels, often containing substantial amounts of drugs like opium, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, or various stimulants, all without regulation or disclosure. By the 1000s for nearly every complaint. Soothing syrups for teething children, laden with morphine. Vigor pills for men, often containing strychnine or yohimbe. Slimming tablets for women, perhaps laced with thyroid extract or arsenic. And nervine elixirs for the anxious, frequently containing cannabis or opiates. Advertising posters showed radiant mothers and babies thanks to Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which unfortunately was morphine in sweetened water and sometimes led to fatal overdoses in infants, or promised relief from asthma by smoking Dr. Whoever's medicated cigarettes, which contained stramonium and tobacco to open the lungs. Consumers often had no idea what was in these products. They simply knew that after a spoonful, they felt better. It's easy to see then how drug dependency in various forms touched all levels of society in the 19th century. But rarely was it seen as a moral failing. More often it was an accepted risk of seeking relief from life's pains. As long as one obtained one's laudanum or morphine from a doctor or an apothecary, it was considered a medical matter, not a legal one. There were exceptions, for instance, opium smoking, a practice associated with Chinese immigrants in Western countries, was often viewed with more suspicion. In places like San Francisco, where many Chinese arrived during the gold rush and built communities, opium smoking in dens became a common practice among them and some non-Chinese bohemians. This led to perhaps the first drug-specific law in American history, an 1875 San Francisco ordinance that banned opium dens, though notably it did not ban opium itself or opium eating. It was aimed at the dens and implicitly at the Chinese community. The image of the Chinaman in the opium den entered Western pop culture as something illicit and exotic, reflecting both the growing awareness of addiction and the xenophobia of the era. We see here a seed of what would become a pattern: drug use by a marginalized group being treated not just as a health issue, but as a moral or criminal issue. While opiates and cocaine took the spotlight, another plant quietly played its part in 19th century pharmacies: cannabis. Western medicine had largely ignored cannabis for a long time, but in 1839, an Irish physician named William O'Shaughnessy, working in Calcutta, published a paper on the uses of Indian hemp, after observing its effectiveness in treating ailments like muscle spasms and rheumatism in local practices. Cannabis tinctures and extracts soon made their way into British and American medical texts. By the late 1000s, 800 Sachs remedies for insomnia, pain, and nervous conditions often included cannabis, usually labeled cannabis indica. For example, you might buy a bottle of Tilden's extract of cannabis indica to help with your stomach pain or to quiet a cough. It was not as ubiquitous as opium or as exhilarating as cocaine, but it was part of the apothecary's arsenal. Using it carried no special stigma. It was simply another option the doctor might recommend for your ailment, and many people likely took it without even knowing much about it, beyond perhaps a slight feeling of calm it provided. As the 19th century drew to a close, chemistry and industry delivered yet more potent innovations. In 1874, an English chemist, C.R. Wright, boiled morphine with certain acids and produced diacetylmorphine, later to be called heroin. For a couple of decades, this compound remained a laboratory curiosity. But in 1898, the German pharmaceutical company Bayer began marketing a new cough suppressant and pain remedy under the trademark heroin. They touted it as a wonder drug, even suggesting, fatally incorrectly, that it was not addictive like morphine. Heroin was especially promoted for children's coughs and for adults with respiratory issues like tuberculosis, where controlling coughing was a major relief. Free samples went out to physicians worldwide. Patients and doctors alike were impressed. At first, a drop of this elixir would indeed banish a cough, and seem to elevate the mood besides. Unfortunately, heroin turned out to metabolize into morphine in the body, and to be even more euphoric and fast-acting when injected. Early 20th century doctors soon started seeing cases of heroin habit cropping up, and Bayer quietly ceased publicizing the drug. But by then, heroin had entered the scene, both as a valued medicine in hospitals and as a new source of abuse on city streets. Parallel to heroin's introduction, a new class of lab-med sedatives was emerging, the barbiturates. In 1864, Adolf von Baer synthesized barbituric acid, but it wasn't pharmacologically useful on its own. In 1903, however, the first active barbiturate, barbital, trade name Veranil, was introduced as a sleeping aid. Soon, barbiturates like phenobarbital became common prescriptions for insomnia, anxiety, and epilepsy. They were effective at inducing sleep, but overdose could be lethal and regular use could lead to dependency, foreshadowing yet another cycle of miracle cure to public health concern, which would fully play out later in the 20th century. By 1900, Western nations were in the midst of what we might call a drug saturation. So many potent substances were available in some form that it's not surprising an early backlash was brewing. This came not from the users themselves, who were often quietly suffering rather than agitating, but from the emerging class of progressive era reformers. These reformers were concerned about public health, consumer protection, and morality. They started shining a light on the patent medicine industry and addiction. Journalists like Samuel Hopkins Adams wrote exposés, such as The Great American Fraud in 1905, revealing how many nostrums owed their effects to undisclosed drugs, and how unsuspecting housewives or laborers were becoming drug dependent. The public was shocked to learn that the soothing syrups they gave their infants were essentially opium, or that the pick-me-up tonics they drank for fatigue were laced with cocaine. This outcry led to some of the first modern drug regulations. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the US forced medicine manufacturers to list certain active ingredients on labels: alcohol, opium/morphine, cocaine, chlorohydrate, cannabis, etc., and prohibited outrageous claims. It didn't ban these drugs, they remained legal in medicines, but it aimed to ensure transparency and honesty. Armed with new knowledge, many consumers adjusted their choices. Patent medicine sales fell for those concoctions now clearly labeled contains morphine or 20% alcohol, and doctors became more cautious in prescribing. On the international stage, concern was especially focused on opium. The devastating situation in China finally begun to reverse after 1900, when the Qing dynasty and Western powers, prodded by missionary and Chinese Christian advocacy, agreed to gradually curb the opium trade. In 1909, the International Opium Commission convened in Shanghai, the first multinational drug control effort. Nations discussed limiting the export of opium and morphine and sharing information. This led to the Hague Opium Convention of 1912, an early treaty where signatories agreed to control and reduce the trade in opium, morphine, and cocaine, restricting them to medical use. Following through on these global ideals, individual countries started enacting domestic laws. In the United States, the landmark was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. This federal law didn't outright ban opiates or cocaine, but it regulated and taxed them. It required anyone who imported, produced, sold, or dispensed these drugs to register and pay a tax, and in so doing it aimed to confine their distribution to legitimate medical channels. Non-medical possession or sale became effectively illegal without a tax stamp, and the government didn't issue tax stamps to users. At the time, this was presented not as prohibition, but as a reasonable regulation. However, its enforcement soon took a punitive turn. By the late 1910s, doctors prescribing maintenance doses of morphine or heroin to addicted patients, a common compassionate practice then, were being arrested under the Harrison Act's interpretation, because maintaining an addiction was ruled not a legitimate medical purpose. Thousands of Americans who had quietly been getting their dose from the drugstore or doctor suddenly found themselves cut off and criminalized if they sought relief elsewhere. Thus, a black market for these drugs, previously hardly necessary, began to form in the shadows. The silent war on drugs, fought not between nations but within societies, was beginning. Yet ironically, just as the US clamped down on opiates and cocaine, it embarked on a far more grandiose banning experiment: alcohol prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the US Constitution, which took effect in 1920, outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. This noble experiment was driven by a powerful temperance movement that saw alcohol as the cause of societal ills. For 13 years, the nation went legally dry. In reality, however, a great thirst persisted. Speakeasies, secret bars, bootleggers, and organized crime stepped in. Notorious gangsters grew rich and bowled off the illicit liquor trade, their exploits sometimes oddly glamorous in the public imagination, undermining the noble intent of the law. Enforcement was spotty and corruption common. While alcohol consumption initially dropped, it eventually crept back up as people found ways around the law. Prohibition did reduce some alcohol harm for a time, but it also arguably caused new problems: toxic moonshine liquor, booming criminal syndicates, and a general disrespect for the law. By 1933, the public mood had shifted and prohibition was repealed. The lesson many took was that you could not simply legislate away a widely desired commodity without significant unintended consequences. The speakeasy era had revealed that demand finds a supply, one way or another. Oddly, this lesson was not at first applied to other drugs, perhaps because their user bases were smaller or lacked political clout. In the 1920 S and 30s, the US doubled down on narcotic prohibition and even extended it. One man, Harry J. Anslinger, who became the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, was particularly zealous. Aside from strictly enforcing the Harrison Act on opiates and cocaine, Anslinger turned his attention to cannabis, which had largely flown under the radar federally. Cannabis was legal in many states, though a few had passed bans influenced by fears that its use was spreading among certain communities. In the 1930s, Anslinger launched a campaign against marijuana, the spelling then, painting it as a dire social threat. The campaign used every trick of propaganda, from sensational films warning of reefer madness to xenophobic tropes tying the drug to Mexican immigrants and African-American jazz musicians, all painting cannabis as a menace to decent society. Yet, in the real jazz clubs and speakeasies of that era, one might find a more benign reality. In a dimly lit Harlem music hall, the pianist plays a lazy blues as a thin haze of cannabis smoke mingles with the trumpet's melody. A few friends share a furtive puff in the corner, swaying gently with half-closed eyes, finding a brief, sweet escape in the music and mood of the night. Nonetheless, sensational stories in the press linked marijuana to violence and moral decay, almost always attributing such behavior to marginalized users. This scaremongering paved the way for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, effectively criminalizing cannabis nationwide by taxing it prohibitively for non-medical use. Thus, cannabis joined the ranks of forbidden substances, and a stigma around it was cemented that would endure for decades. By the late 1930s then, the world of drugs had split into two legal landscapes. On one side were the accepted drugs: alcohol, legal again, but regulated; tobacco, widely used and promoted with health risks still downplayed; caffeine, coffee and tea, unquestioned daily staples; and a growing array of pharmaceuticals obtainable by prescription: barbiturates, amphetamines, new pain relievers. On the other side were the demonized drugs: opiates, cocaine, cannabis, and a few others, now under strict legal control. Their users increasingly seen as deviants or criminals rather than patients. This division was as much cultural and racial as pharmacological. It was not necessarily that heroin was more dangerous than alcohol in every way, but society's narratives had cast one as unacceptable and the other as tradition. From a quiet, historical perspective, we can see parallels across time. Just as medieval and early modern authorities tried and failed to suppress certain popular drugs, like coffee or tobacco, modern authorities were finding that outlawing opiates or marijuana did not simply erase them. Instead, new criminal enterprises emerged to supply the continued demand, and users were pushed to the margins The stage was set for the turbulent drug saga of the later 20th century, where these silent wars on drugs would escalate dramatically. Before we move to that next act, consider the world on the eve of World War II. Morphine, heroin, and cocaine were illegal for non-medical use in most countries, yet a small underworld trade persisted. Cannabis was banned or discouraged in many places, though still used quietly by certain groups: jazz musicians in the US, bohemians in Paris, traditional users in India where the British allowed bang during religious festivals. Amphetamines, newly popular since the 1930s as pick-me-ups and diet pills, were still legal and would soon be given to soldiers by the millions during the coming war. Barbiturates were commonplace for sleep problems, and millions of people still soothed themselves with legal alcohol and tobacco daily. It was a complex, dynamic picture, a patchwork of attitudes and laws. Now, the mid-20th century was about to bring even more change. Scientific and medical advances would introduce a host of new drugs, from psychiatric medications to synthetic hallucinogens, and cultural upheavals would give rise to new patterns of use and new philosophies, from the controlled environment of the laboratory to the uncontrolled freedom of the 1960 counterculture. Likewise, governments would double down on the punitive approach, declaring a formal war on drugs that would have profound consequences globally. So let us continue calmly and observantly into the post-war era of the 20th century, a time of laboratory wonders, social rebellion, heavy-handed policies, and the ongoing human quest for relief and release. The period after World War II brought new complexities to the history of drugs. It was a time of stark contrasts. On one hand, unprecedented scientific breakthroughs and new medicines that improved or saved lives. On the other hand, a rising tide of recreational drug use and experimentation that alarmed authorities and set the stage for a global crackdown. The narrative grows louder in this era, yet in our gentle telling, we will observe these changes calmly, noting the recurring patterns even amid the twists of modern history. In the 1940 and 50s, optimism about medical science was at its peak. New synthetic drugs and antibiotics were conquering diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. Amid this progress, psychoactive drugs also found new roles. Amphetamines, first synthesized in the late 19th century but largely unexplored until the 1930s, became widely used during World War II. Soldiers on all sides were issued little benzodrine pills to stay alert on long missions and to counter fatigue in battle. From bomber pilots flying overnight raids to infantrymen on exhausting marches, millions of troops used these stimulants as a matter of course. After the war, amphetamines filtered into civilian life. In the 1950s, one could buy benzodrine inhalers over the counter in American drugstores for nasal congestion, and many people discovered the little cotton strip inside, soaked in amphetamine, could be removed and swallowed for a burst of energy and euphoria. Pep pills became popular among students cramming for exams, truck drivers on long hauls, athletes seeking a competitive edge, and housewives trying to manage busy households and perhaps lose a bit of weight. Doctors often prescribed amphetamines as diet pills. At first, this use was seen as practical and relatively harmless, a modern way to enhance productivity and mood. But as some individuals began to abuse these pills, using them compulsively and sleeplessly, the downsides became apparent: jitteriness, paranoia, and the crash of exhaustion and depression when the drug wore off. A quiet amphetamine dependency problem was growing, though it remained mostly in the shadows during the 50s, overshadowed by society's focus on other drugs. Meanwhile, in the realm of psychiatry, the mid-20th century saw both breakthroughs and unorthodox experiments. The 1950s are often called the beginning of modern psychopharmacology because of the discovery of medications like chlorpromazine, thorazine, the first antipsychotic, and imipramine, one of the first antidepressants. These drugs, not recreational at all, nonetheless dramatically altered how society dealt with mental illness, often replacing morphine or sedatives or even shock therapies in psychiatric wards with targeted chemical treatment. Parallel to these developments, there was growing interest and curiosity about hallucinogens. In 1943, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann unexpectedly discovered the profound effects of a compound he had synthesized, LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. By the 1950s, psychiatrists and psychologists were exploring LSD and other psychedelics, like mescaline from the peyote cactus and psilocybin from mushrooms, as potential therapeutic tools. These substances could radically alter perception and consciousness for a few hours. Some therapists found that under controlled conditions, psychedelics helped patients break through mental barriers, for example, aiding psychotherapy for alcoholism or trauma by inducing a kind of profound introspection or spiritual experience. The CIA, on a darker note, experimented secretly with LSD for mind control possibilities, the now infamous MK Ultra program, giving it to unwitting subjects to observe its effects. But psychedelics would not remain confined to clinics and covert tests for long. By the early 1960s, they began to escape into the broader culture, championed by certain academics, intellectuals, and writers. This was an era of youthful rebellion and questioning of authority in many Western countries. In the United States, as the civil rights movement and anti-Vietnam War protests swelled, a parallel counterculture emerged among many young people. They sought new ways of living that rejected what they saw as the conformism and materialism of their parents' world. Psychoactive drugs, especially cannabis and LSD, became part of that rebellion. Cannabis had been illegal in the US since the 1937 law, but enforcement in the 1940s and 50s was relatively limited, focused mainly on certain urban areas and jazz scenes. By the 20s and 1960s, however, cannabis use surged on college campuses and among the hippie youth. It was a gentle defiance, smoking a joint at a protest or in a park while strumming a guitar and singing about peace. The drug's effects, relaxation, introspection, enhanced appreciation of music and food, fit well with the values of this counterculture, which emphasize peace, love, and an expansion of consciousness. LSD, still legal in the early 60s, was promoted by figures like Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary, who famously encouraged people to turn on, tune in, drop out, suggesting that LSD use could be a path to profound personal and societal transformation. In San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, in New York's Greenwich Village, in London's swinging Soho, young people experimented with these substances in a spirit of exploration. The colorful psychedelia in the art and music of that era, swirling neon patterns, surreal lyrics, and imagery, was one imprint of this drug-fueled exploration. One can picture, for instance, a vast outdoor rock festival as night falls in 1969. Crowds of young people wrapped in blankets and tie-dye, a gentle haze in the air. As the beloved band plays under pulsing colored lights, some in the audience are feeling the first dreamy waves of an LSD trip, or the mellow calm of a shared joint. In that moment, under the twinkling stars, many feel a profound unity with the music, with each other, with nature, a feeling they might simply describe as love. It was a fleeting experience, perhaps, but emblematic of a generation's hope that expanding the mind might help heal the world. Not everyone viewed this blossoming of drug use so serenely. By the late 1960s, authorities grew increasingly concerned. Stories, sometimes exaggerated, of bad trips, rising youth rebellion, and the highly visible nature of the counterculture prompted a backlash. Governments began cracking down. LSD was made illegal in California in 1966 and banned federally in the US, and in many countries by the late 60s, arrests for marijuana possession climbed. The generation gap was stark. To many in the establishment, these drugs symbolized chaos, undermining the work ethic and patriotism. To the youth, they symbolized liberation and a challenge to hypocrisy. After all, they pointed out, many older folks drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes, yet condemned marijuana as evil. By 1971, US President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and launched what he called a total war on drugs. Thus, the term war on drugs took hold. In practice, this meant greatly increased funding for drug law enforcement, new legislation with stricter penalties, and diplomatic pressure on other countries to do the same. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 had already established schedules to classify drugs by their potential for abuse and medical value. LSD, cannabis, peyote, and later MDMA, ecstasy, and others will be placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, meaning they were deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, making them illegal to possess or use under federal law. Heroin was also Schedule 1, with morphine in Schedule 2, recognizing medical use for pain, and cocaine was Schedule 2, since it did have medical use as a local anesthetic. These classifications, heavily influenced by political climate as much as scientific assessment, effectively ended legitimate research on psychedelics and cannabis for decades. They also set the stage for a massive increase in law enforcement activities targeting drug production, distribution, and use. It's important to note, though, that not all countries mirrored the US approach exactly. Some, like the Netherlands, took a slightly different path. In 1976, the Dutch government formally decriminalized possession of small amounts of cannabis and allowed the now famous coffee shops to sell it openly under regulated conditions. They distinguished between hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc., which they pursued aggressively, and moffed drugs, cannabis, believing a separation of markets would help prevent cannabis users from moving to harder drugs. This approach emphasized tolerance and public health over punishment for minor drug use. Likewise, places like the UK maintained a more medicalized approach to addiction for a time. Doctors in Britain could still, in the 1960s and 70s, prescribe heroin or methadone to addicts as a way of managing the problem, the so-called British system, avoiding the criminalization of the user. But the dominant trend globally by the late 1970s was towards stricter control, influenced both by US pressure and the UN's 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which consolidated international agreements to prohibit non-medical use of many drugs. The late 1970s, and especially the 1980s, saw an escalation of the war on drugs. In the US, under President Ronald Reagan, enforcement and penalties became even tougher. New laws mandated lengthy prison sentences for relatively minor offenses, especially under the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. A notable and tragic development was the crack cocaine epidemic. Around 1984, a smokable form of cocaine called crack, for the crackling sound it made when heated, became widely available in American cities, selling in small, affordable quantities. Its effects were intensely euphoric but very short-lived, leading users into rapid cycles of craving and often addiction. Crack spread in many poor urban neighborhoods, fueling crime and straining communities already suffering from unemployment and social disinvestment. The media portrayed crack as a kind of urban plague, with nightly news segments showing crack house raids and crying children. Politicians responded with zero-tolerance rhetoric. The laws made penalties for crack cocaine far harsher than for the same amount of powder cocaine, disproportionately impacted African American communities versus the predominantly white powder cocaine using demographic. By the late 80s, US prisons were filling up with low-level drug offenders, many of them young men caught with small amounts of crack or other drugs, often serving longer sentences than those convicted of violent crimes. While the US and some other countries, like the UK under Margaret Thatcher, focused on law and order approaches, a few voices began to advocate a different strategy known as harm reduction. This philosophy argued that completely eradicating drugs was unrealistic, and that a more pragmatic goal was to reduce the harm associated with drug use. Out of this mindset came programs like needle exchanges, providing sterile syringes to injection drug users to prevent the spread of HIV and other diseases, and opioid substitution therapy like methadone maintenance clinics for heroin users. The idea was to meet people where they're at and keep them alive and as healthy as possible, even if they weren't ready or able to quit drugs entirely. Harm reduction started in places like the Netherlands, the UK, and Australia in the 80s. At the time, critics claimed it sent the wrong message or would encourage drug use, but the evidence soon showed it saved lives. By the late 1000s, 980s countries that embraced needle exchanges saw clear declines in HIV transmission among drug users. You can imagine the modest storefront of a needle exchange in Amsterdam or Sydney around that time. Early morning light, a few individuals who use drugs quietly lining up, exchanging used syringes for clean ones, maybe grabbing a cup of hot tea and a pamphlet about detox programs. A nurse or social worker greets each person by name, perhaps the only judgment-free interaction they'll have that day. Such simple, compassionate exchanges help keep them safe and alive. A humble, humane response that proved more effective than any amount of scolding or punishment. In 1985, the small country of Portugal was experiencing serious drug problems, with 1% of its population addicted to heroin and HIV rates soaring. In 2001, after much study and debate, Portugal took the radical step of decriminalizing the possession of all drugs for personal use. Instead of arresting users, the policy channeled them to dissuasion commissions, panels that could offer counseling, sanctions like fines or community service, and referrals to treatment, but no jail time. Many observers predicted disaster, a spike in drug tourists, rampant use. Instead, a very quiet revolution occurred. Overdose deaths and HIV infections plummeted, and drug use rates, especially among youth, did not skyrocket as feared. They remained comparable or lower than neighboring countries that continued criminalization. Portugal's approach was not to endorse or legalize the drug trade, trafficking was still a crime, but to treat users primarily as people in need of help, not punishment. Over time, this model began to be lauded by public health experts as a success. Throughout the late 20th century, the supply side of the drug war also ramped up internationally. The US and other nations poured money and occasionally military force into trying to stop drugs at their source. This meant coca eradication campaigns in the Andean countries, like spraying herbicides over Colombian jungles, poppy field burnings in places like Burma and later Afghanistan, and covert operations to bust drug labs. It also meant cooperating with countries like Mexico to intercept smugglers. Yet these efforts often resembled a balloon effect. Squeeze in one place and the problem bulges in another. If Colombia cracked down on cocaine, production shifted to Peru or Bolivia for a time, then back. If Miami's coast became too tightly patrolled for smugglers, the cartels moved their routes through Mexico and up through the desert. This era saw the rise and fall of infamous drug kingpins. In the 1980s, the Medellin and Cali cartels in Colombia controlled a huge portion of the world's cocaine supply, wielding wealth and firepower that rivaled national armies. Figures like Pablo Escobar became almost legendary. Some saw him as an outlaw folk hero because he built houses and soccer fields for the poor with his drug money, while others saw the terror he inflicted, car bombs, assassinations of judges and politicians when governments tried to stop him. In Mexico, after Colombia's cartels were curtailed, powerful trafficking organizations grew to dominate the supply routes, leading to what has sometimes been like a low-level war between those groups and the Mexican state, especially from the 2000s onwards, with violence impacting many civilians. In Asia, regions such as the Golden Triangle, where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet, and later Afghanistan, emerged as major sources of opium and heroin, with profits from the drug trade fueling local militias and conflicts. In this way, the fight over drugs sometimes literally fed into wars, adding another layer to the human toll. By the 1990s, a sense was growing among some policymakers and much of the public that the war on drugs, as it had been fought, was not yielding the promised victory. Yes, some people were deterred from using drugs by strict laws, but many were not, or they switched to legal substances like alcohol or new synthetic designer drugs to skirt the law. Prisons were overflowing, yet the drug supply and demand seemed resilient. In the US, as the crack wave ebbed, a new drug problem began creeping in from a different angle: the prescription opioid crisis. In the mid-1990s, pharmaceutical companies introduced new formulations of opioid painkillers like OxyContin, a time-release oxycodone pill, and aggressively marketed them to doctors, reassuring that the risk of addiction was low if used for pain. Doctors, under pressure to treat pain, now dubbed the fifth vital sign, began prescribing these opioids widely for chronic, non-terminal pain conditions. For a while, it seemed a boon. People with long-term pain could get relief at home in a pill, but the availability of these powerful drugs in communities led to diversion and misuse. Some patients found themselves becoming dependent, needing higher doses, going through withdrawal if they ran out. By the early 2000s, opioid-naive populations, people without prior drug issues, were developing addictions originating from medical care. And when prescriptions were cut off, whether due to a crackdown on overprescribing or because doctors realized patients were misusing them, many turned to illicit opioids like heroin, which by then was cheaper and often easier to obtain in some areas than the tightly controlled pills. A particularly tragic turn came in the 2010s with the spread of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid vastly more potent than heroin. Originally a medical painkiller in surgeries and for cancer patients, illicitly made fentanyl began appearing mixed into heroin or pressed into counterfeit pain pills. Because it is so potent, a tiny error in dosing can be fatal. Overdose deaths surged shockingly in North America, making opioid overdoses a leading cause of accidental death. This was not the image of the drug criminal that had been painted in the 80s. These were by and large ordinary people, white, black, and brown, often from working class backgrounds, who became entangled in addiction through a combination of corporate greed, medical misjudgment, and the resilience of the human desire to avoid pain, physical or emotional. Amid this crisis, society's attitudes began shifting again. The idea of addiction as a disease or a public health issue rather than purely a crime gained wider acceptance. Many started calling for treatment, not jail, for people with substance use disorders. Some US states set up drug courts that offered diversion to rehab programs instead of prison for low-level offenders. There was also a re-evaluation of cannabis. Beginning with California's Proposition 215 in 1996, states in the US started legalizing medical marijuana, acknowledging that cannabis can alleviate certain conditions like glaucoma, pain, nausea from chemotherapy, and that patients should not be criminalized for using it. Over time, this led to broader legalization, first for medical use in many states and some countries, Canada, some European nations, etc. And then for general adult recreational use in a few jurisdictions. Uruguay in 2013 was the first country to fully legalize, followed by Canada in 2018. Within the US, Colorado and Washington state pioneered recreational legalization in 2012, and a number of others followed suit. This represented a remarkable reversal of the demonization that had persisted since the 1930s. By the 2020s, in parts of the world, one could walk into a licensed shop and buy cannabis products much as one buys a bottle of wine. Something unthinkable a few decades prior. Another renaissance quietly began. Psychedelic research returned, starting around the 90s, 990s, and accelerating in the 2000s and 2010s. Scientists carefully revisited compounds like LSD, psilocybin from mushrooms, and MDMA, a synthetic drug often associated with 1980s/90s rave culture. With regulatory approval, they conducted rigorous clinical studies to see if these once vilified drugs could help with a hard-to-treat condition. The results were strikingly positive in some cases. Psilocybin-assisted therapy, for instance, showed promise in alleviating major depression and existential distress in cancer patients. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy produced remarkable outcomes for severe PTSD, so much so that MDMA is likely to become an FDA-approved treatment in the near future at this writing. Even ketamine, an anesthetic with hallucinogenic properties, was found to have rapid antidepressant effects and has been repurposed in clinical settings for that use. In other words, science started to confirm what some 1,950 psychiatrists intuited, and what some ancient traditions long believed, that these mind-altering substances can be powerful medicines for the psyche when used with care and respect. In tandem, public perception of drugs like marijuana and psychedelics began to soften, especially among younger generations who grew up seeing parents or grandparents suffer from prescription drug issues on one hand, and seeing peers responsibly use cannabis without society collapsing on the other. Polls showed majority support for cannabis legalization in many countries by the 2010s. The stark black and white moralism of the early drug war era gave way in some quarters to a more nuanced view, one that might sound very familiar to a 16th century herbalist or a 12th century Persian physician. The view that drugs are neither holy saviors nor demons, but tools that can heal or harm depending on how we use them. Yet, challenges abound in the present. Synthetic drugs continue to evolve. Besides fentanyl and its even stronger analogues like carfentanil causing waves of overdose, we have seen surges of so-called designer drugs or research chemicals, lab-created substances that mimic the effects of traditional drugs but are not yet illegal until they emerge and get noticed. For a time around 2010, packets of Spice or K2, synthetic cannabinoids sprayed on herbs, were sold in convenience stores as incense, producing cannabis-like effects but often with unpredictable and sometimes dangerous results, ranging from acute psychosis to heart problems, because the synthetic chemicals, unlike natural cannabis, often bind far more aggressively to brain receptors. Similarly, bath salts, a term for certain synthetic stimulants like mephedrone or alpha-PVP, had a spate of notoriety for causing bizarre, violent behavior in a few instances reported in the media. Each time authorities ban one formula, underground chemists tweak a molecule to create a new variant, a process that challenges the very framework of drug control laws, which typically name specific chemical structures. Internationally, some regions maintain extremely harsh stances. In parts of Southeast Asia, penalties for drug trafficking can include the death penalty, and these laws apply even to relatively small amounts in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The Philippines saw a brutal campaign beginning in 2016 under President Duterte, wherein thousands of alleged street-level drug users and dealers were killed in extrajudicial fashion. These actions, intended to frighten and eliminate the drug trade, shocked the world for their severity. And yet even there, the underlying drug issues, chiefly an epidemic of cheap methamphetamine use among the poor, persist in the shadow. Other regions have boldly moved opposite. We mentioned Portugal's success with decriminalization. Additionally, countries like Switzerland took pioneering steps such as prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to long-term heroin addicts under medical supervision. The Swiss found it improved health and reduced crime among participants, and eventually integrated this approach nationally. Canada, facing a devastating opioid crisis, has started pilot programs of safe injection sites and even safe supply of clean opioids to users to prevent overdose. These harm reduction strategies, once radical, are slowly gaining mainstream support in some parts of the world, as the death toll from drug misuse is weighed against the apparent failure of purely punitive methods. Throughout all these modern developments, one constant remains: the basic motivations for drug use have not much changed since ancient times. People still seek relief from physical pain, escape from emotional suffering, better performance at tasks, or simply a way to experience novel sensations and insights. The means and the social context evolve, but the fundamental human desires are recognizable. Now, as our long, quiet journey through history nears its close, we can reflect on the recurring patterns and what they reveal. We have seen how each era and culture grappled with similar questions. Which substances do we embrace and ritually integrate? Which do we tolerate privately? Which do we fear and forbid? Often, the answers have as much to do with cultural narratives and who is using the substance as with the substance's actual pharma. A stimulant like coffee was first viewed with suspicion in Ottoman Turkey. Some 16th century clerics called it an intoxicant and wanted it banned, but later became a respected aid to sober work and thought. Just as many centuries on, a different stimulant, amphetamine, went from being sold as a pick-meat to being seen mainly as a dangerous street drug, speed, to most recently being a prescribed medicine again for AD, or consider opium. A revered medicine in Sumer and a useful Victorian household remedy becomes, by the 20th century, a feared scourge associated in the public mind with crime and decay, even though it's essentially the same substance with the same effects across those times. As long as people seek meaning and relief, the poppy will bloom, the vine will untwine, the leaf will unfurl, and the mushroom will spring from the earth, silent companions waiting, as they always have. History suggests that our efforts to control drugs are really efforts to balance the benefits and risks in a way that aligns with our values and knowledge at that time. Sometimes we get it largely right and improve well-being, other times we cause suffering in the name of preventing it. And indeed, as long as people walk the earth, the relationships will continue. Today's forbidden drug may be tomorrow's medicine, and today's widely used drug may tomorrow be seen as a threat. We need only think of how attitudes toward nicotine have shifted in recent decades. But with the perspective of the ages, perhaps we become a little wiser. Increasingly, there is recognition that compassion and education must accompany enforcement, that understanding the reasons people turn to substances, whether trauma, curiosity, pain, or tradition, is crucial if we wish to minimize harm, and that, like the healer around the ancient fire or the shaman in the tent, guidance can often channel the use of a powerful plant in a beneficial way, whereas ignorance can lead to danger. Now the hour is late and the fire of our imagination burns low. We can step back from these tales of potions and powders, of hopes and fears. Let the images of time settle in your mind. The healer, the priestess, the farmer, the poet, the rebel, the scientist. Generations upon generations finding, using, misusing, banning, and rediscovering the gifts and curses of nature's chemistry. It is a human story as much as it is a drug story, each reflecting the other. In this gentle darkness, we recognize that the history of drugs is really a history of humanity's attempt to alleviate suffering and enhance existence, sometimes wisely, sometimes recklessly. The substances themselves, whether brewed from a plant or synthesized in a lab, hold no moral force. It is we who impart meaning to them, as sacrament or scourge, medicine or poison, vice or virtue. And so, our narration comes to a close. Close your eyes and rest now, knowing that this long tale of humans and their ancient companions, those healing, inspiring, and sometimes perilous plants and potions, will continue to unfold quietly, as it always has. From sacred roots to silent wars, from prehistory to the present, these threads persist. Perhaps in understanding the past, we can tread a little more thoughtfully into the future. For now, simply breathe in the quiet of the night. Imagine the soft glow of embers where our storyteller sat. The story ends, but its echoes remain. In the smoke of a distant hearth, in the pages of an old manuscript, in the vials of a modern laboratory, and in the gentle, eternal human yearning for a connection to something deeper, something that eases the journey. Good night and sleep well, with these reflections from ages past drifting calmly through your dreams like a gentle, timeless river.